In 1968, the most beautiful building in New York City was sentenced to death, not by fire, not by accident, but by greed. Grand Central Terminal, the crown jewel of American architecture, was marked for demolition. Wrecking balls were ready. Plans were drawn. A 55-story office tower would rise where the terminal's celestial ceiling once inspired millions of travelers to look up in wonder. But what the developers didn't anticipate was a fight. A fight led by a former First Lady, a Supreme Court battle that would change American preservation law forever, and a city that finally understood what it meant to lose an irreplaceable piece of its soul. Because just 7 years earlier, New York had watched in horror as another magnificent terminal was torn apart, brick by brick, beam by beam, until nothing remained but photographs and regret. This is the story of how Grand Central Terminal was supposed to die, how Penn Station's destruction became the warning nobody heeded until it was almost too late, and how a building became the symbol of everything America was willing to destroy in the name of progress. If you want to discover the truth about one of America's most iconic structures and the conspiracy that nearly erased it from history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We dive deep into the hidden stories of America's greatest buildings, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. The story of Grand Central Terminal begins with one of America's wealthiest and most ruthless businessmen. Cornelius Vanderbilt, known as the Commodore, built his fortune on steamships and railroads. By the 1860s, he controlled most of the rail lines running in and out of New York City. But he had a problem. His trains terminated at 26th Street and 4th Avenue, forcing passengers to transfer to horse-drawn carriages to reach downtown Manhattan. It was inefficient, uncomfortable, and unprofitable. Vanderbilt wanted a grand terminal in the heart of the city. In 1869, he opened the first Grand Central Depot at 42nd Street and Park Avenue. It was an engineering marvel for its time, with 3 stories of iron and glass covering multiple train platforms. But Vanderbilt's vision went beyond simple functionality. He understood that great buildings could be monuments to power, symbols of an empire that stretched across the continent. The original depot served the city for decades, but by the turn of the 20th century, it was clear that New York had outgrown it. The city was exploding with growth. Immigration was transforming the population. Skyscrapers were rising across Manhattan, and the railroads were struggling to keep up with demand. The depot was overcrowded, outdated, and dangerous. Steam locomotives filled the underground train yard with smoke so thick that engineers couldn't see the signals. Accidents were common. On January 8th, 1902, disaster struck. A commuter train crashed in the Park Avenue tunnel, killing 15 people and injuring dozens more. The engineer claimed he couldn't see the stop signal through the dense smoke. The public was outraged. The city demanded change, and the New York Central Railroad, now controlled by Cornelius Vanderbilt's grandson William, faced a choice. They could patch up the old depot and hope for the best, or they could tear it down and build something extraordinary. William Vanderbilt chose extraordinary. He hired the architectural firms of Reed and Stem and Warren and Wetmore to design a new terminal that would dwarf anything America had ever seen. But this wasn't just about building a bigger train station. This was about creating a monument that would stand for centuries. A cathedral to the age of rail travel, a symbol of American ambition and achievement. The architects presented a revolutionary design. The new Grand Central Terminal would be built on 2 levels, with trains running on the upper and lower concourses. Electric trains would replace the dangerous steam locomotives, solving the smoke problem forever. Ramps instead of stairs would allow passengers to flow smoothly between levels, and above it all would rise the main concourse, a space so vast and beautiful that it would transform the simple act of catching a train into something approaching spiritual experience. Construction began in 1903. It would take 10 years to complete, require the demolition of hundreds of buildings, and cost over $2 billion in today's money. More than 10,000 workers labored around the clock, excavating millions of cubic yards of rock and dirt, laying miles of track, pouring endless tons of concrete and steel. The project was so massive that it transformed the entire surrounding neighborhood. Park Avenue, once a dirty industrial corridor, became one of Manhattan's most prestigious addresses. The terminal's design incorporated innovations that seem obvious today but were revolutionary in 1913. The 2-level track system allowed trains to arrive and depart without interfering with each other. The electric trains eliminated smoke and noise. The ramps and wide corridors prevented the dangerous bottlenecks that had plagued the old depot. And the main concourse, inspired by the great public baths of ancient Rome, created a gathering space unlike anything in America. But it was the details that made Grand Central truly magnificent. The main concourse ceiling stretched 125 feet overhead, painted with a mural of the Mediterranean sky showing 2,500 stars in the constellations of the zodiac. Tennessee marble covered the floors. Enormous arched windows flooded the space with natural light. The information booth in the center, topped with its famous 4-faced clock made of opal, became the most popular meeting spot in New York City. On February 2nd, 1913, Grand Central Terminal officially opened to the public. 150,000 people poured through its doors on opening day, marveling at the architecture, the technology, the sheer ambition of what the Vanderbilts had created. Newspapers called it the greatest railway terminal in the world. Architects praised it as a masterpiece of Beaux-Arts design, and travelers discovered that catching a train could be transformed from a frustrating necessity into an experience of beauty and wonder. The terminal wasn't just a place to catch trains. It became the heart of New York City, a gathering point for soldiers heading to war, immigrants arriving to start new lives, families reuniting after years apart, lovers meeting under the famous clock. Every major event in American history from 1913 onward passed through Grand Central's corridors. It witnessed the Roaring Twenties, survived the Great Depression, sent millions of soldiers to 2 world wars, and welcomed them home again. Before we continue with how this magnificent building nearly disappeared forever, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. The story gets even darker from here, and you'll want to see how close we came to losing one of America's greatest architectural treasures. The decades following Grand Central's opening marked the golden age of American rail travel. Trains connected every major city in the country. Luxury railcars offered amenities that rivaled the finest hotels. And Grand Central Terminal stood at the center of it all, the gateway to America for anyone arriving in or departing from New York City. The terminal processed more than 65 million passengers each year at its peak. That's more people than passed through all of New York's airports combined in the same period. Commuters from Connecticut, Westchester, and upstate New York flooded through its doors every morning and evening. Long-distance travelers departed for Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, and everywhere in between. The 20th Century Limited, the most famous luxury train in America, left from Track 34 every afternoon at 6, carrying celebrities, business tycoons, and anyone wealthy enough to afford the fare on its overnight journey to Chicago. Grand Central became more than a transportation hub. It evolved into a self-contained city beneath the streets of Manhattan. The lower levels housed restaurants, shops, barber shops, medical offices, even a police station and a small hospital. The Oyster Bar, which opened with the terminal in 1913, became one of New York's most famous restaurants. Thousands of commuters grabbed lunch at the luncheonette counters or picked up groceries at the market on their way home. But beneath the public spaces, hidden from view, was an entire world that most travelers never knew existed. Secret tunnels connected Grand Central to surrounding buildings, including the Waldorf Astoria Hotel and the basement of the Yale Club. Track 61, a private platform hidden deep below the terminal, provided secret access for presidents and dignitaries. Franklin Roosevelt used it to arrive in New York without being seen, carefully hiding his disability from the public. The most fascinating secret space was a hidden apartment on the terminal's 4th floor. The terminal master, who oversaw all operations, lived in a fully furnished residence complete with bedroom, bathroom, and kitchen. He could monitor everything happening in the terminal without ever leaving the building. This apartment remained occupied until the 1980s, a tiny home hidden inside one of the world's busiest public spaces. During World War II, Grand Central took on new significance. More than 1 million soldiers passed through the terminal on their way to ships waiting in New York Harbor. The main concourse information booth became a meeting point for families saying goodbye to sons and husbands heading overseas. A service. Lounge on the 2nd floor offered free coffee, sandwiches, and a place to rest for any service member passing through the city. But the war also transformed Grand Central into a strategic military asset. In the terminal's deepest basement level, 60 feet below the main concourse, the military constructed a secret command center known as M42. This hidden room, protected by thick concrete walls and accessed through a concealed doorway disguised as an ordinary supply closet, housed communications equipment that could coordinate military movements across the entire eastern seaboard. If New York came under attack, military commanders could direct the defense from this underground bunker. The existence of M42 remained classified until the 1980s. Most terminal employees had no idea it existed. The few who did were sworn to secrecy. The room contained maps of the entire rail network, secure telephone lines connecting to Washington, and enough supplies to sustain a small staff for weeks if they had to remain underground during an attack. Today, the room still exists, though it's been converted to storage. The post-war years brought continued prosperity to Grand Central and the New York Central Railroad. The economy was booming. Americans had money to travel. The suburbs were expanding, bringing more commuters through the terminal every day. The future looked bright. But beneath the surface, forces were already gathering that would threaten Grand Central's very existence. The automobile was changing American life. President Eisenhower's interstate highway system, begun in 1956, made car travel faster and more convenient than ever before. Commercial aviation was expanding rapidly, with jet aircraft making long-distance train travel seem slow and outdated, and the suburbs that fed commuters into Grand Central were spreading farther from the city, beyond the reach of rail lines. The New York Central Railroad began losing money. Passenger numbers started declining in the late 1950s and accelerated through the 1960s. Freight traffic, once the backbone of railroad profits, shifted to trucks using the new interstate highways. The company was bleeding cash, unable to compete with planes and automobiles, watching helplessly as the world moved on from the great age of rail travel. By the 1960s, Grand Central Terminal had transformed from a profitable asset into a financial burden. The building required constant maintenance. The vast underground infrastructure needed repairs, but the railroad didn't have the money to properly maintain the terminal, much less upgrade it for a modern era. Paint peeled from the ceiling, dirt accumulated on the marble floors. The once magnificent building began to look shabby and neglected. Railroad executives started looking for ways to generate revenue from the terminal itself. They leased space inside the building for advertising. Enormous billboards covered the main concourse walls, blocking the windows and hiding the architectural details. They sold naming rights and plastered corporate logos across every available surface. The beautiful waiting rooms were converted to commercial space. The grandeur that had inspired travelers for 50 years was buried beneath a layer of advertising and commercial exploitation. But the executives wanted more. They looked at Grand Central Terminal, sitting on some of the most valuable real estate in Manhattan, and saw wasted potential. The terminal occupied acres of land in the heart of Midtown. If they could demolish the building and construct an office tower in its place, they could generate hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. The age of rail travel was dying anyway. Why preserve a monument to the past when the future demanded office space and modern architecture? The plan was simple and devastating. Tear down Grand Central Terminal. Build the tallest office tower in the world and keep a small modern train station in the basement, just enough to handle the remaining commuters who still depended on the rail lines. The main concourse, the celestial ceiling, the Tennessee marble, the architectural masterpiece that took 10 years to build, would be reduced to rubble and carted away. And they had every reason to believe they would succeed, because just a few years earlier, New York had allowed the destruction of another magnificent terminal, and barely anyone had lifted a finger to stop it. Pennsylvania Station, Grand Central's sister terminal on the west side of Manhattan, was in many ways even more magnificent than Grand Central itself. Completed in 1910, 3 years before Grand Central opened, Penn Station was designed by the architectural firm McKim, Mead, and White in the style of ancient Roman baths. The main waiting room, inspired by the baths of Caracalla, featured massive Corinthian columns rising 150 feet to a vaulted glass ceiling. Sunlight poured through the glass roof, illuminating the pink granite and travertine stone that covered every surface. Architectural critics called Penn Station one of the finest examples of Beaux-Arts architecture in the world. The American Institute of Architects praised it as a triumph of classical design adapted for modern purposes. Travelers entering the waiting room often stopped in their tracks, overwhelmed by the scale and beauty of the space. Like Grand Central, Penn Station transformed the mundane act of catching a train into an experience that elevated the human spirit. But by the 1950s, Penn Station faced the same problems plaguing Grand Central. The Pennsylvania Railroad was losing money, passenger numbers were declining, maintenance costs were soaring, and the land beneath the terminal, covering nearly 8 acres in Midtown Manhattan, was worth a fortune. Railroad executives made the same calculation their counterparts at New York. Central would make a few years later. The terminal was a financial burden. The real estate was a goldmine. The choice seemed obvious. In 1962, the Pennsylvania Railroad announced plans to demolish Penn Station. They would build Madison Square Garden and an office tower complex in its place, relegating the train station to a cramped underground space beneath the new development. The announcement shocked many New Yorkers who loved Penn Station, but the general public reaction was surprisingly muted. Most people seemed to accept that progress required sacrifice. Old buildings had to make way for new ones. That's how cities evolved. A small group of architects, preservationists, and concerned citizens tried to stop the demolition. They argued that Penn Station was irreplaceable, that its destruction would rob New York of one of its greatest treasures, that the city would regret this decision for generations. The American Institute of Architects called the plan demolition an act of vandalism. Prominent architects offered alternative plans that would preserve the terminal while still allowing commercial development, but they had no legal authority to stop it. New York City had no landmarks preservation law. If the railroad owned the building and wanted to tear it down, nothing could prevent it. On October 28, 1963, demolition began. Workers started dismantling the magnificent waiting room, piece by piece. The enormous Corinthian columns were toppled and broken apart. Pink granite and travertine stone was hauled away as fill for marshland in New Jersey. And the beautiful glass ceiling that had illuminated the space for more than 50 years was shattered and thrown in dumpsters. The destruction of Penn Station took 3 years. Throughout that entire period, photographs of the demolition appeared in newspapers and magazines. New Yorkers watched as one of their greatest buildings was systematically erased from existence. And as the destruction continued, public opinion began to shift. People started asking whether this was really necessary, whether progress really required destroying irreplaceable beauty, whether New York was losing something vital to its identity. The architectural critic Vincent Scully wrote what became the most famous statement about Penn Station's destruction. One entered the city like a god. One scuttles in now like a rat. He captured the transformation that demolition represented. Penn Station had made arriving in New York City a transcendent experience. The new underground station, cramped and ugly and purely functional, stripped away all dignity and grandeur from the act of travel. By the time demolition was complete in 1966, the public mood had changed dramatically. Polls showed that most New Yorkers regretted the loss of Penn Station. Architectural organizations called it the greatest act of architectural vandalism in American history. Preservationists pointed to Penn Station as proof that America was destroying its heritage for short-term profit, and politicians began to recognize that allowing the destruction had been a terrible mistake. In 1965, while Penn Station was still being demolished, New York City passed the Landmarks Preservation Law. The new law gave the city power to designate buildings as historic landmarks and prevent their destruction without special permission from a newly created Landmarks Preservation Commission. It was too late to save Penn Station, but future buildings could be protected if the commission acted in time. The problem was that landmark designation came with significant restrictions. Property owners couldn't demolish or significantly alter designated buildings without permission. This could limit their ability to develop their land and potentially reduce its value. Not everyone supported these restrictions. Developers argued that property rights were being violated. Building owners complained that landmark designation reduced their property values, and railroad executives, watching their companies slide toward bankruptcy, became increasingly desperate to find ways to generate revenue from their real estate holdings. Grand Central Terminal, despite its architectural significance and historical importance, was not initially designated as a landmark. The Landmarks Preservation Commission was overwhelmed with nominations and moved slowly through the designation process. Railroad executives saw an opportunity. If they could move forward with demolition plans before Grand Central received landmark protection, they might be able to destroy the terminal just as Penn Station had been destroyed. The lessons from Penn Station's destruction were clear to everyone involved. Public opposition to demolition would be fierce. Preservationists would fight much harder to save Grand Central than they had fought for Penn Station. The city might try to use the new landmarks law to prevent demolition, but the railroad executives also knew that Penn Station's owners had successfully completed their demolition despite public outcry. If they moved quickly and decisively, they might be able to present demolition as a fait accompli before opposition could organize effectively. In 1968, just 2 years after Penn Station's demolition was completed, the Penn Central Railroad, formed from the merger of the New York Central and Pennsylvania Railroads, announced the first of several plans to demolish Grand Central Terminal and replace it with a modern office tower. The same fate that had befallen Penn Station was now threatening Grand Central, and this time, the battle to save it would go all the way to the Supreme Court. The first demolition plan was audacious in its scope and brutal in its disregard for Grand Central's architecture. In 1968, the Penn Central Railroad partnered with a real estate developer to propose the construction of a 55-story office tower directly above the terminal. The plan called for demolishing the main concourse entirely, removing the celestial ceiling, tearing out the grand staircases, and gutting the interior of the building down to its steel frame. A small modern train station would be constructed in the basement levels, just enough to handle the reduced number of commuters still using the rail lines. Above it would rise a massive glass and steel office tower, designed by renowned architect Marcel Breuer in the brutalist style popular at the time. The tower would generate enormous rental income for the cash-starved railroad, solving its financial problems while providing modern office space in the heart of Manhattan. To the railroad executives, the plan made perfect financial sense. Grand Central Terminal was costing them millions of dollars each year in maintenance and operating expenses while generating relatively little revenue. The building was half a century old, designed for an era of rail travel that was rapidly disappearing. Preserving it seemed like sentimental nostalgia at the expense of economic reality. Why should a private company be forced to maintain an old building that no longer served its original purpose efficiently? But the public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The Penn Station demolition was still fresh in New York's collective memory. Losing one magnificent terminal had been traumatic enough. Losing both was unthinkable. Preservationists immediately mobilized to oppose the plan. The Municipal Art Society, the American Institute of Architects, and dozens of other organizations announced their opposition. And in August 1967, the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission designated Grand Central Terminal as an official city landmark. The landmark designation should have ended the demolition threat. Under the Landmarks Preservation Law, the railroad couldn't demolish or significantly alter Grand Central without permission from the Landmarks Preservation Commission, and the commission had made clear it would not approve the Brewer Tower plan, but the railroad wasn't ready to give up. They argued that the Landmarks Law was unconstitutional, that it violated their property rights by preventing them from developing their own land. The railroad's argument centered on a legal concept called regulatory taking. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution states that private property cannot be taken for public use without just compensation. The railroad argued that landmark designation constituted a taking, preventing them from using their property as they saw fit and reducing its value by hundreds of millions of dollars. If the city wanted to preserve Grand Central as a landmark, the railroad claimed, the city should be required to purchase the property or compensate the railroad for the lost development value. In 1969, the railroad filed a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the Landmarks Law. The case, eventually known as Penn Central Transportation Company versus City of New York, would take 9 years to resolve and ultimately reach the Supreme Court. While the legal battle played out, Grand Central Terminal existed in a state of limbo. The railroad couldn't demolish it, but they also had little incentive to properly maintain it. The building continued to deteriorate. The railroad's financial situation grew more desperate as the legal battle continued. In 1970, Penn Central filed for bankruptcy, the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history at that time. The company was collapsing under the weight of declining passenger numbers, competition from trucks and airplanes, and decades of deferred maintenance on its rail infrastructure. Grand Central Terminal, rather than being seen as a valuable asset, was viewed as an albatross dragging the company toward insolvency. During this period, Grand Central fell into serious disrepair. The railroad had no money for maintenance and no legal pathway to demolition. The main concourse ceiling, which should have been cleaned regularly, became covered in decades of accumulated grime and cigarette smoke. The original colors of the Zodiac mural were barely visible beneath the dirt. Water leaked through the roof, damaging the plaster and threatening the structural integrity of the ceiling. The Tennessee marble floors were cracked and stained. The entire building looked tired and neglected. Some observers began to argue that maybe demolition was the right solution after all. If the railroad couldn't afford to maintain Grand Central, and if the city wasn't willing to take over ownership and pay for the necessary repairs, perhaps it would be better to replace it with a modern building that could be properly maintained. The brutalist office tower wouldn't have the beauty and grandeur of the original terminal, but at least it would be functional and economically viable. Preservationists watched in horror as public opinion began to shift. They had won the legal battle to prevent immediate demolition, but they were losing the war of public perception. Grand Central was becoming an embarrassment, a dirty and deteriorating reminder of past glory rather than a functioning piece of city infrastructure. If they couldn't find a way to restore and revitalize the building, landmark designation might prove to be only a temporary reprieve. The railroad, meanwhile, continued to develop alternative plans for Grand Central. Each new proposal tested the boundaries of what the Landmarks Preservation Commission might approve. One plan called for building a tower on top of the terminal while preserving the main concourse. Another suggested demolishing the eastern portion of the building while keeping the iconic facade facing 42nd Street. The railroad was clearly searching for any development option that might generate revenue, while technically complying with the Landmarks Law. Throughout the early 1970s, the future of Grand Central Terminal hung in the balance. The Supreme Court case was working its way through the legal system, but a final decision was years away. The building was deteriorating rapidly. The railroad was bankrupt and desperate for any source of revenue. And New York City, facing its own financial crisis, had no money to purchase or restore the terminal even if the railroad had been willing to sell. Into this situation stepped an unlikely savior. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, widow of President John Kennedy and one of the most famous women in America, decided to use her celebrity and influence to save Grand Central Terminal. Her involvement would transform the preservation battle from a local New York issue into a national cause that would ultimately change how America thinks about historic preservation. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis had watched the destruction of Penn Station with the same horror and regret that many New Yorkers felt. She understood that great architecture was irreplaceable, that once demolished, buildings like Penn Station and Grand Central could never be recreated. The craftsmanship, the materials, the artistry that went into their construction belonged to an era that no longer existed. Losing them meant losing a tangible connection to America's past. In 1975, she joined the board of the Municipal Art Society, one of the leading organizations fighting to preserve Grand Central. Her involvement brought immediate national attention to the cause. Newspapers and magazines that might have ignored a local preservation battle in New York suddenly covered the story extensively because Jackie Kennedy was involved. Her fame became a powerful weapon in the fight to save Grand Central. She understood the power of publicity and used it brilliantly. She organized public campaigns, gave speeches, wrote articles, and used her connections to influential people in media, politics, and business to build support for preservation. She framed the battle over Grand Central not as a dispute over property rights or development economics, but as a question of American identity. What kind of country destroys its greatest architectural achievements? What kind of city tears down its most beautiful buildings? In January 1975, she held a press conference at Grand Central Terminal that captured national attention. Standing in the main concourse beneath the dirt covered celestial ceiling, she made an impassioned plea for preservation. If we don't care about our past, we can't have very much hope for our future, she said. We've all heard that it's too late, that the demolition of Pennsylvania Station was a fait accompli, and now Grand Central is doomed. But we can't let that happen. The press conference generated enormous publicity. Newspapers across the country ran stories about Jackie Kennedy's fight to save Grand Central. Television news programs covered the preservation battle. Public opinion began to shift decisively in favor of preservation. Polls showed that most Americans, not just New Yorkers, wanted to see Grand Central saved. The building had become a symbol of something larger than itself, a test of whether America valued its architectural heritage or was willing to sacrifice everything to short term economic interests. The railroad executives found themselves in an increasingly difficult position. They couldn't demolish Grand Central because of the landmark designation, but they also couldn't develop the property in any way that would generate significant revenue. And now, thanks to Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis and the preservationists, public opinion was overwhelmingly against them. Any attempt to revive demolition plans would face massive public opposition. The legal battle, meanwhile, was approaching its conclusion. Lower courts had upheld the constitutionality of the landmarks law, rejecting the railroad's argument that landmark designation constituted an unconstitutional taking of property. But the railroad appealed each decision, determined to take the case all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary. In 1977, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. The oral arguments before the Supreme Court took place on April 19, 1978. The railroad's lawyers argued that the landmarks law destroyed the economic value of their property without compensation, violating the Fifth Amendment's prohibition against taking private property for public use without just compensation. They pointed out that landmark designation prevented them from developing one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in Manhattan, costing them hundreds of millions of dollars in potential revenue. The city's lawyers countered that landmark designation was a valid exercise of police power to protect the public welfare. They argued that historic preservation served important public purposes, including maintaining the character of neighborhoods, preserving cultural heritage, and promoting tourism and economic development. The landmarks law didn't take the railroad's property, it merely regulated how that property could be used, just as zoning laws and building codes regulate property use without requiring compensation. The case attracted enormous attention. Legal scholars recognized that the Supreme Court's decision would determine the future of historic preservation laws across America. If the court struck down New York's landmarks law, similar laws in other cities would likely be invalidated as well. Historic preservation, as a legal concept with teeth, would effectively cease to exist. Property owners would be free to demolish historic buildings regardless of their architectural or cultural significance. On June 26, 1978, the Supreme Court issued its decision. In a 6-3 ruling, the court upheld the constitutionality of New York's landmarks preservation law. Justice William Brennan, writing for the majority, rejected the railroad's taking claim. He noted that the landmarks law still allowed the railroad to use Grand Central Terminal as a railroad terminal, its historic and current use. The law didn't prevent all economically viable use of the property, it merely prevented one particular use, namely demolition and construction of an office tower. The decision was a watershed moment for historic preservation in America. It established that cities and states could designate buildings as landmarks and restrict their alteration or demolition without having to pay compensation to property owners. Historic preservation laws across the country were validated and strengthened. The decision made clear that architectural and cultural heritage had legal standing alongside economic development in determining how property could be used. For Grand Central Terminal, the Supreme Court decision meant survival. The demolition threat was finally, definitively ended. The railroad could no longer argue that the landmarks law was unconstitutional or that they had a right to demolish the building. Grand Central would be preserved for future generations. The preservation battle which had lasted more than a decade and consumed enormous energy and resources, was finally over. But victory in the legal battle didn't solve all of Grand Central's problems. The building was still deteriorating. The railroad, now reorganized after bankruptcy as Conrail, still couldn't afford proper maintenance. The main concourse ceiling was still covered in dirt. Water damage threatened structural elements. The terminal needed a comprehensive restoration, estimated to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Saving Grand Central from demolition was only the first step. Restoring it to its former glory would require even more effort. The restoration of Grand Central Terminal took another 2 decades to complete. In 1983, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority purchased the terminal from the railroad, taking on responsibility for its maintenance and operation, but it wasn't until the 1990s that sufficient funding was secured for a comprehensive restoration. The restoration project, which began in 1994 and was completed in 1998, was one of the most ambitious historic preservation efforts in American history. Workers carefully cleaned the main concourse ceiling, revealing the vibrant colors of the zodiac mural that had been hidden beneath decades of grime. They discovered that the ceiling had been painted backwards, with the constellations reversed from their actual positions in the sky. This error, made during the original construction and never corrected, became a charming quirk that added to the terminal's character. The Tennessee marble floors were meticulously restored. The grand staircases were rebuilt. The enormous, arched windows, which had been covered with advertising for decades, were uncovered and cleaned, allowing natural light to flood the main concourse once again. Modern amenities were added, including new lighting, upgraded mechanical systems, and improved accessibility features, all designed to blend seamlessly with the historic architecture. The restored Grand Central Terminal reopened to enormous fanfare in 1998, 85 years after it first opened in 1913. The restoration won numerous awards and was celebrated as a triumph of historic preservation. Visitors who remembered the dirty, deteriorating terminal of the 1970s and 80s could barely believe the transformation. The building looked better than it had in decades, perhaps better than it had ever looked. Today, Grand Central Terminal serves more than 750,000 people each day, making it one of the busiest transit hubs in the world. It remains a fully functioning railroad terminal, just as it was designed to be more than a century ago. But it's also much more than that. It's a shopping destination, with dozens of stores and restaurants filling the lower levels. It's a tourist attraction, drawing millions of visitors each year who come simply to admire the architecture. And it's a symbol of New York City itself, as iconic as the Statue of Liberty or the Empire State Building. The battle to save Grand Central Terminal had consequences that extended far beyond one building in New York. The Supreme Court decision validated historic preservation laws across America, encouraging cities to designate and protect their most important buildings. The publicity generated by Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis and other preservationists raised public awareness about the importance of architectural heritage, and the successful restoration demonstrated that old buildings could be adapted for modern use without destroying their historic character. Penn Station's destruction became a cautionary tale that preservationists invoked whenever an important building was threatened. The loss was so profound, the public regret so deep, that it fundamentally changed how Americans thought about their architectural heritage. Before Penn Station, demolition of old buildings was generally accepted as a necessary part of urban progress. After Penn Station, preservation became a value that most Americans supported, at least in principle. But the story of Grand Central also reveals the complexity of historic preservation. The railroad executives who wanted to demolish the terminal weren't villains motivated by greed alone. They were struggling with real financial problems, trying to keep a dying company alive in an industry that was being destroyed by competition from cars and airplanes. The landmarks law prevented them from using their property in the most economically valuable way, imposing real costs on a company that couldn't afford them. This tension between preservation and property rights continues to shape debates about historic buildings today. Should private property owners be required to maintain expensive historic buildings even when it's not economically rational to do so? Should the public compensate property owners for the reduced value that landmark designation imposes? How do we balance the public interest in preserving architectural heritage against the private interest in using property profitably? These questions, first raised by the Grand Central case, remain unresolved and contentious. What's clear is that Grand Central Terminal survived because enough people decided it was worth fighting for. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, the preservationists, the city officials who passed the landmarks law, and the Supreme Court justices who upheld it all played essential roles. But so did ordinary New Yorkers and Americans across the country who spoke up, wrote letters, and made clear that they valued historic architecture and wanted it preserved. The terminal that was supposed to die became instead a symbol of successful preservation, proof that great buildings can be saved if people care enough to fight for them. Every time you walk through Grand Central's main concourse, look up at the celestial ceiling, or meet someone under the famous four faced clock, you're experiencing something that almost didn't exist. The most beautiful building in New York City came within a wrecking ball swing of being reduced to rubble. That it survived is a testament to the power of preservation, the importance of architectural heritage, and the enduring belief that some things are too valuable to lose. If you found this story as compelling as we did, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who loves architecture and history, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into America's most iconic structures. We have more incredible stories coming about the buildings that shaped our nation and the battles fought to preserve them. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.